I'm not ready. I'm ready.
Hello and welcome to BeerCraft, Colorado's craft beer show. We are here live at the Studio Kitchen, Colorado, home of the Modern Eater Radio Network. I'm here with Andrew Moore from Intrepid Sojourner Beer Project. I'm Jeff Tyler from Spice Trade Brewery. And this is BeerCraft. This is the weekly video podcast show that goes over the history, culture, ingredients, and the industry within the world of craft beer. Every week, we tackle a different topic regarding craft beer. This month's topic is stout. We had two other shows this month. The first episode we had, if you haven't seen them, they're great episodes. Check them out. The first episode was on the history of stout. Lots of cool information there. And the second episode was a technical brewing of stout episode with some really talented brewers in the state of Colorado. Check those episodes out if you haven't seen them already. This week, we are tackling adjuncts, specifically coffee and spices. We have some really great guests from Savory Spice Shop, from Novo Coffee, and from Copper Door Coffee Company here with us today to talk about those ingredients. We're going to deep dive into those ingredients. We're going to talk about cultivation of those ingredients, where they come from, how they make it to your supermarket, how they make it into your beverages, and finally get into how they make it into your beer.
Yeah, it's hard to. This is episode 3. It feels like, I don't know, episode 2.
It does, but for some reason, it's episode 3.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, so here we are live in Studio Kitchen, Colorado, home of the Modern Eater Network. And I'm really excited about this show. I mean, brewing with adjuncts is what we do.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, me too. So we've been using spices in beer for a long time. We've been doing coffee in beer for a long time. And, you know, there's a lot of different ways to get these ingredients into your beer. You know, on a personal level, I'm a huge fan of coffee, and I cook a lot, so I'm a big fan of spices. So to kind of see how those work on a culinary level into food, but also see how they work into beer, I'm kind of excited to dive into it. There's a lot of different ways to incorporate these ingredients into beer.
Yeah, well, I don't feel like we should wait. The smell of coffee is already wafting over the table.
We don't have smell-o-vision yet on Facebook Live, but it smells amazing in here.
Well, that's something else. So we are on Facebook Live. So at any point during the next hour, when you're watching this show, instead of doing whatever work that you're supposed to be doing on a Wednesday afternoon, feel free to get in there, ask us some questions, and we'll try to work it into the show and get an answer for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's dive into it. Let's talk about some coffee.
Yes.
Yeah? So I'd like to introduce a couple of our guests from the coffee world. We have Josh Taves from Novo Coffee and Penny Garrett from Copper Door. Let's talk about coffee. We have two different coffee methods, brewing methods in front of us, and we're gonna kick the show off by making some coffee. So Josh, I guess if you want to start off, just tell a little bit about Novo and kind of your background in the coffee world.
Yeah. So yeah, my name's Josh. I'm the director of quality control and business development for Novo Coffee here in Denver. We've been around for going on 16 plus years at this point here in Denver. Family owned and operated coffee roasting company. Yeah, and my background in coffee, I've been working in coffee for basically since I got a car and could drive to the coffee shop.
Nice.
15, 16 years or so. And yeah, I've done a lot of different things in the coffee industry, but I worked with a lot of different breweries over the years. Yeah, so.
Awesome.
Done a lot of coffee brewers.
Sweet.
Mm-hmm.
Penny, how about you?
Kind of similar. I love how the story of coffee and the way that it brings people together, and kind of how, my relationship with it started, much like you, like driving to the local cafe or whatever. So yeah, but I started working as a barista in coffee shops to begin with, and did that for probably 10 years, and then got a little burnt out on that and stepped out for a little while, and then found my way into, I still wanted to be involved in coffee, but I wanted to take a deeper dive. And I have a background I've studied botany and herbal medicine, and so getting onto the kind of the backside of coffee and learning about the green coffee trade and learning about farmers and visiting farms and how the coffee gets here, and that whole side of it is much more exciting to me at this point. So I'm at Copper Door Coffee Roasters, and Copper Door has been an entity for about 12 years. Hannah Olbrick took it over 6 years ago and built the first brick and mortar shop. And October 2017, we opened a bigger roastery at First and Santa Fe. So now we have a nice cafe space, and people can see the roaster, and we have classes there and that sort of thing.
Nice.
And my role there encompasses a lot. I've actually just deciding to change my job title to coffee curator because I do a lot of things. I onboard wholesale clients and teach classes and work with the roaster and sometimes work in the cafe. And so, yeah,
Cool.
lots of hats.
Jill of all trades. Awesome. Well, I'm excited to get into some of these brewing methods. I think coffee is an amazingly popular beverage. It's the second most consumed beverage in the world. Any guesses for the first? I'm sure you guys know.
Coca-Cola or water?
Yeah, well, water's number one. From what I found, tea is the number one, and then coffee, and then probably Coca-Cola after that. But yeah, so it's amazingly
Beer's gotta be
popular.
up there.
Beer, yeah, it's up there.
Does anyone drink
It's got to
beer,
be up
or-
there.
We drink beer.
Yeah.
I drink beer.
We drink enough beer for several people.
Yeah, yes, we do.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, we really up the average, I think, is what we're doing. That's our contribution.
Yeah, you're welcome.
But yeah, we drink like 1.4 billion cups of coffee worldwide every day. So there's lots of coffee getting consumed every day. And to that end, there's a lot of different ways to make your coffee, right?
So many.
So many different preparation methods. I think the most common that everyone is familiar with is kind of the traditional drip coffee, your coffee pot, right? So you got a bucket of coffee grounds, it drips through, goes into a pot, you drink your coffee. I'd love to have you guys chat about the other preparation methods, maybe starting with the ones that you have in front of you.
Yeah, sure. So I'll go first since mine has a lot of downtime, and then you can talk in between. How's that?
Sounds great.
Okay.
Nice.
So this is called the Cupping Brewer from Radaware Coffee Products. And yeah, it's basically going to simulate the cupping process. So coffee cupping is a process that happens mostly on the wholesale side. It's like a quality control tasting for roasters. It doesn't often translate to the cafe just because there's a lot of barriers to entry and weird tasting practices that are foreign to folks. But it allows for comparative brewing is the idea. And so it's also a very simple filterless brewing method. It just kind of allows the coffee to be what it's going to be without any, added input of filters or pouring methods or style of pour over brewer or anything like that. And so that's what I'm going to brew for you today. It's basically just going to sit for 4 minutes. So this is my scale here, and I'm going to turn it on.
Let's just take a step back. This is a cupping method that you designed and hold a patent on. Is that right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
That's pretty
so
awesome.
Cupping, this is going to emulate the exact same process, but typically it's just done in like a little 6-ounce Gibraltar glass. And so, yeah, this is just a method. It allows you to brew more product at a time. And typically when you're cupping, you have to leave the glass setting on the table because the grounds will settle to the bottom, and you don't want to disturb them. So you have to leave the glass on the table, and then you drink with a spoon. And everyone shares the same cup. So the idea here is...
It's like elevated cowboy coffee.
Yeah, basically. But the idea is a very neutral brewing method for evaluation.
Gotcha.
And so this guy will emulate the exact same thing. It's just going to allow us all to have our own cup of coffee.
Yeah.
Because it's making a higher volume, and because it will, you'll see in the end, separate the grounds from the water, even though it's going through the same brewing process.
Nice.
So.
Yeah, I like that idea of having as few variables as possible when you're just trying to evaluate what the coffee tastes like.
Yep. Yeah, and you can use it for tea and all kinds of other things too. But basically, all I'm going to do is just going to fill it up and start the timer. And I'm using a gram scale here to measure the amount of water I'm using. It's a really simple ratio. I'm using 30 grams of coffee on a medium coarse grind, and I'm going to use 500 grams of water.
Great. And how long is this going to steep for? I know with like a French press method, it's maybe, 4 minutes?
4 minutes.
Roughly?
4, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm going to let it sit for 4 minutes, and then I'm going to give it a little stir. And what's going to happen is that most of the coffee grounds will have been saturated at that point, and they're going to lose buoyancy when they're saturated and will fall back down to the bottom where they were before. At 4 minutes, when I stir it, any ground still sitting on top will be fully saturated and fall. And then after a few minutes, we'll put the plunger back in to seal off the lower chamber, and we'll pour the liquid out of the top. It'll be ground free. So
Nice.
Fantastic.
anyways, yeah, and that's it for the next couple minutes. So.
Yeah.
Great.
And this is a Chemex. This is a baby Chemex. The one I think maybe people are a little more familiar with is a bit bigger. It's I think that one's considered a 9 cup, and that's small cups, 6 ounces or 4 ounces or something. And this is the little guy. So yeah, this I really like brewing with this. I think it's a lovely device. So it's pretty for people, and also one of the things that Chemex is known for is a thicker paper filter. So it's one of the cleanest ways to brew. Yeah, and I am also here, I've got a gram scale. So I've got 23 grams in here, and I'm going to pour 350 grams of water. And
Is it a similar kind of grind, that sort of like medium coarse grind? Is that like the preferred cupping
Well,
grind?
this is probably a little bit different because this isn't considered cupping. This would be a hand pour.
Sure.
So you can go a little bit finer if you have a filter than if you are doing the method without a filter?
You know, it has more to do with the angle of the top section,
Okay.
honestly, with how it's all going to pour through the device.
Okay.
Can I borrow one of these?
Yeah.
Since I forgot
And
something.
how do you figure out the ratio with the grounds to water? Like, what's the method behind that?
Most people, I think, just have a starting point. You know, common is somewhere in the range of 1 to 14, 1 to 15,
Okay.
1 to 16.
Yeah, I've kind of wondered that.
You can
Yeah.
start there and see what you think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
There's a million variables. Like, you can get real geeky about
Okay.
these things. Yeah.
What that means too, that people often overthink, I found, is that's 1 to 15 if you're weighing the same. You need the same unit of measurement on both ends.
Okay.
So which means you need to use a metric system.
Yep.
Yeah.
Because if you're weighing ounces of water and solid ounces, those are actually two different
Right,
measurements
right.
in the standard system. And so this is all talking about using, with the assumption you're working with grams in the
Yeah.
metric system.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right.
We wish we had the metric system.
I wish we had the metric system. It makes
Definitely.
everything so easy. I love it. Well, we have a little bit of time, I guess, while we're waiting for these to brew.
This will be done in about a minute, but
About
you
a
give
minute.
a little time.
I'd love to kind of dig into the history of coffee because I think it has a really fascinating history. Doing a little bit of research, you quickly understand that, as with most things, Americans consume the most coffee out of any country in the world, but we don't grow any coffee in the United States except for Hawaii.
Correct.
So I'd love to chat about the growing conditions that are required to grow coffee, and maybe get into a little bit of why we can't grow it in the United States and where it's come from and what regions it really hails from.
Yeah, do you want to?
Yeah,
Speak
well,
to that?
sure. So coffee is a tropical plant, so that means it thrives between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn, right? The tropics.
Yep.
Along the equator. In general, there's a lot of places you can grow coffee, and in fact, they do grow coffee in the on the mainland here, if you will, or like in the contiguous 48 in California. It just doesn't do very well.
Are they
And
using
it's-
greenhouses?
A lot of it, I think, yeah. Like similar situations like avocado farms, but it's just experimental mostly. So that being said, there's a lot of places you can grow coffee. What we'll talk about is where coffee grows well and where it's going to taste good.
Gotcha.
So generally tropics and at higher elevations. So the best coffee is going to come from at least 1,000 meters above sea level. So like our elevation here in Denver would be pretty prime if it was also hot and humid.
Yeah, I wish part of me wishes it was a little hot and humid here.
Yeah.
Oh,
Sometimes.
Yep. It
Yeah.
also does really well with good soil drainage too. So typically, it's on a coffee farm is not like what we think of as farms. They don't really use mechanical harvesting most of the time because it's very difficult to get mechanical equipment to the places where the coffee's growing. It's a shade plant, so it needs to be it thrives underneath the canopy, and so there's usually a lot of other things going on a coffee farm: shade trees, slopes, steep hillsides, mountainous terrain.
Coffee actually has very little carbohydrate, and so if it's grown at a higher elevation and it's allowed to develop over a longer period of time, it has more time to develop carbohydrate, which a roaster can turn into sugars, a good roaster, and also other constituents that end up tasting really good in the cup. So, and generally those coffees growing at higher elevations and growing more slowly and being harvested in a really precise way that's specialty coffee, right? And that's usually Arabica, a species. A lot of your commodity coffees, like which tends to be primarily Robusta, grows at a lower elevation, and it actually develops much faster. So caffeine's an insecticide on the plant, and so when the coffee's at a lower elevation and it's even hotter, there's more insects, so it can create more caffeine. But it's almost like it develops too fast. And the specialty coffee world is experimenting with specialty Robusta, and that's a pretty interesting project. But I've only tasted a little bit of it, and it, compared to some of the really wild and beautiful flavors that we can get in specialty Arabica, fruits and flowers and all of these things, it was pretty muted. It tasted, if you've ever had Genmaicha tea, I think I'm saying that right, with the toasted rice, the green tea.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
That's a lot
Sure.
what the even the very well grown Robusta, that's what it tasted like to me. So kind of grassy,
Fascinating.
green, toasty,
Yeah.
but not fruit and flowers or anything
Right.
like that.
Yeah.
Right.
Your note about the caffeine got me thinking. This is something we were trying to decide earlier. Is when does the caffeine come into the process? Like if you
chew
chew
on
on the
a
green
coffee bean, does that
are you
going to
get that same kind of zing that you get from drinking what we're
Well,
about to drink?
I think so. I mean, the longer the coffee's roasted, dark roasted coffee, a lot of people think it's stronger, but it, as grossly oversimplified, it probably has less caffeine because you're roasting that constituent out. So lighter roast coffees tend to be a little zippier, and I haven't chewed on a green coffee bean, but
Yeah.
you probably
Well,
feel
we have
something.
some here, so if you're
We-
feeling adventurous,
Probably a
Yeah.
little bitter.
you could try.
Yeah.
I'd say.
I can attest that if you eat too much coffee fruit, it gets a little goofy.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I think like you guys mentioned earlier, coffee is. People think of coffee farm, and maybe their minds go to kind of monoculture crops that we're used to growing in the United States, where it's rows and rows of corn, and it's all mechanically harvested, and it's pretty straightforward. But coffee, like you mentioned, is not like that. It's grown mostly on steep mountainsides. It's picked manually. I think, Jay, we have a picture of a coffee plant, and we have another picture. I actually took a trip to Colombia a couple years ago, and we visited a couple coffee farms in the area, and you find people picking these coffee shrubs by hand, and then packing it all onto a mule, and then going down the mountainside. It's very, very separate from riding on a tractor harvesting something.
Sure.
And so I think there's not really an appreciation for how hard it is to grow coffee.
Well, and the cherries all develop at a different rate, and so if you have somebody that's really good at harvesting, I mean, it can be really tempting, right, to let's just go harvest the whole tree, but then you're taking green and yellow and
Right.
not, underripe red and ripe red, and really what you want to, if somebody's really taking care, they're only picking the reddest cherries
Right.
off the
Yeah, and I think
plant.
that picture actually shows it. Even it's on the same shrub, some of them are bright red, some of them are still green. So you have to be.
Interesting.
You can't just harvest them all at once.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really interesting stuff.
To be fair, there is a little bit of mechanical harvesting that happens, centralized in Brazil and small pieces of Costa Rica and some very large-scale coffee production areas.
Okay.
But the vast majority of all coffee worldwide is, picked by hand.
I would guess like your Folgers is probably all being,
Right.
mechanically
Sure.
harvested.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's, if you see someone that says their coffee's hand-picked, it's just coffee.
Right. Yeah, it's just standard coffee.
Like cold filtered beer.
Sure.
Yeah, like I just heard a commercial for Coors. It's like cold packaged beer. I'm like, if you're not packaging your beer and you force carbonate it, like I don't know how you're doing that, because you'd end up with flat beer and
Yeah.
a mess.
They're buzzwords
Yeah.
for people.
They are.
Triple hopped cold filtered.
Yeah. So let's talk about Cascara a little bit, because I think Cascara is super interesting. I'll hand it off to you guys to explain what Cascara is, but it's interesting to see that it's starting to become more common as its own beverage, whereas I think previously it wasn't really even exported.
A
It
waste
was
product.
a waste product or fertilizer, right?
Yeah, so Cascara is, when it's on the fruit, they call it the hull. It's like the skin of the fruit. And the flesh of the fruit is so, I don't know the word I want to use for it. It's just like there's so much moisture to it that and it's very, very thin around the seed, because the coffee, what we call a bean, is actually the seed of the fruit, right? And there's such little flesh of the fruit that when you remove the hull, the fruit just kind of turns into mush, right? But the skin does stay together. The hull does stay together. And so what farmers have been doing recently, and this is just experimentation that started happening in the last 10 years or so, is they'll take those, the hulls of the fruit, and they'll dry them.
Okay.
And turn it into this product called Cascara, which is just basically sold as a tea.
Okay.
It has some difficulties catching on, because for most farmers, the value in Cascara is just as compost to put back into their soil to help with the next year's crop.
Right.
B, a lot of them don't have the processing equipment to do this. And C, even if you do have the processing equipment to do this, it's really hard to have it meet FDA approval because
Sure.
of all the places that little things can hide. And they're not roasting it, they're not baking it, they're just drying it. So it's really difficult to have a raw product that you just sort of dried on your farm and then have it be okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But it can be yummy. It kind of reminds me of dried I don't know, a cross between like rose hips and prunes or something.
Oh,
It's,
okay.
the same-
That's
it's
the-
like a really
okay.
distinct flavor that's
Yeah.
not like what I think of when I think about coffee flavor.
Yeah,
Like it's very
very
different.
different.
No, it's
Oh,
it's more fruity.
Yeah, it's much more fruity
It
and
is
like
the fruit.
when it's dried, it's almost like a little bit like leathery and like you said, prune, but almost like a nice tobacco or something. And
It always reminds me of when I was a kid. My mom would put those little fruit leather things, like the
Yeah.
Yeah, it does.
Still love
Yeah.
those things.
Yeah, that's what it tastes.
Okay. Oh, interesting.
Some people are serving it like a cold Cascara tea sparkling, which is it's sweetened a little bit. Is really
Yeah.
delicious.
Yeah.
that sounds.
And I do see it. I'm
Delicious.
starting to you see it in beer also.
Yeah.
I'm sure we'll get to
okay.
that.
Yeah, we've
Great.
made Cascara beer before.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely an interesting ingredient. I mean, it's kind of gaining this like cult superfood status too because it's high in antioxidants. So I
Okay.
think there's other beverages starting to come
High in
out.
caffeine.
And
It's the new acai.
yeah, the
Yeah.
new acai. Yeah,
Which was the new blueberry, which was the
Yeah,
Yeah.
superfoods.
the latest.
Love it.
and
You can make
greatest
tea from
superfood.
the blossoms too, which I
Oh.
think usually they're left to become a coffee cherry. But if
Yeah.
you get your hand on some blossoms, they're like
Interesting.
lovely and kind of like a light jasmine tea.
Awesome.
So it looks like we've got some coffee in front of us.
Yeah.
This is a natural Ethiopian yogurt. It's one of my favorites.
One of my
It's
faves.
kind of like a blueberry muffin.
Yeah.
hmm
Hmm.
we this is we've done a bunch of pairings with different breweries, and this one was put in a pale ale with Sam Adams.
Nice.
So, yeah.
Great.
Wow. They must have bought a lot of coffee from you guys if they're brewing one of. I'm guessing it was their pilot size system. But you said this went into a Sam Adams beer.
Yeah, I mean it was it was like a small run,
Small run stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
special limited micro lot,
It's
whatever.
fantastic.
So, I mean, we know a lot about kind of tasting beer, but maybe you could kind of explain the process that you go through when you're tasting a coffee. If there is a process to critically evaluate it. And again, not to I get this all the time from people. You shouldn't necessarily be critically evaluating your beverages all the time.
Right.
You can lose a lot of friends that way, so sometimes it's good just to hang out and drink your
just
beverage.
drink,
But if you do want to kind of critically evaluate it and, just understand what it is you're drinking and dig through the flavors, how do you go about doing that with coffee?
That's where the cupping comes in.
That's where the cupping
Yeah,
comes
and like
in.
Josh was saying, it's not seen in the cafe a lot, but it's big for quality control, roasters, importers,
I can
on the farm
demonstrate
side.
and show you why it's not used in the cafe.
Let's
Yeah.
do it. Yeah.
All right.
It's rude. It's loud and rude.
Ooh.
That was a noise.
Solid.
I like
In
that.
the
That's gonna be
geeky
an audio
coffee
clip we
community,
use over and over.
the louder your slurp is, you can get some props for that.
Nice. Okay.
It's like belching to complement the
Yeah,
food.
exactly. So you're trying to aerate the coffee as you bring it in to kind
Exactly.
of bust those volatile aromatics out to make them more available
Yeah,
Yep.
exactly.
and be as loud as you can.
Well, and you want to coat, so like probably 75%-ish of what you're tasting is actually volatile aromatics that are being picked up by your olfactory. And the rest of what's left are just heavy, undissolved solids that are settling on your mouth and on your palate. And so, you got like the 7th grade biology tongue thing going on, but you also have a lot of touch receptors in the back of your throat, and in your cheeks. And you got to kind of get all that coated with a very little bit. And the reason you use a spoon is because, like I said, in traditional cupping, you can't pick up the glass. 'Cause you don't want to disturb the ground bed that's formed. So you use a spoon and you just have a little tiny bit in there, and you got to kind of get all of that coated so you slurp and aerate. And you're also cooling the coffee and doing all kinds of different things.
yeah.
More similar to wine then.
It's pretty similar,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And it gets assessed. A bunch of different aspects get assessed. So we'll smell the coffee, and then once we start slurping, we'll assess the flavor and the acidity and the mouthfeel and the sweetness and how well balanced are the acidity and the sweetness and how is the overall cup and it can get really complicated. Some of it is not just what you're tasting; it's how it's physically reacting in your mouth. That'll tell you what some of the predominant acids are, and it can get
Yeah.
really,
Yeah,
really
yeah.
geeky and very
Yeah, I'd love
sciencey.
Good balance on that one.
This
The
coffee,
yogurt cafe, yeah.
yeah,
Mhm.
I love this coffee.
Yep.
I'd love to get into the discussion about roasts because, like you said, the farmer has one set of skills that they're really using to bring a agricultural item to maturity, and then when you get the beans, it's kind of your responsibility as a roaster to display the flavors of that ingredient as best as you possibly can. So, we're tasting through a couple different coffees right now, so it'll give some context. But what are the things that you think about when you're getting a new bean in from a certain area, and how do you go about figuring how to roast that to really showcase the flavors, and maybe we chat about the flavor wheel a little bit too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you want to start?
Sure. And then you can get into the flavor wheel stuff.
Sure.
Yeah. I mean, I think, roasters are kind of like chefs, and there's a million different ways that you can approach it. So I think a lot of roasters have maybe an idea of, what they want to represent with their coffee. So I feel like if I had to describe that for Copper Door, we want to highlight what's best, what's most prevalent about coffee from a certain region. We're not trying to change it dramatically. We want Ethiopians to taste like Ethiopians and Costa Ricans to taste like Costa Rica. But from there, I mean, it's just like I said, I think I'm not a roaster, so there's a lot that I don't know, but understanding the chemical process of what's happening in the roaster and how to, as I said before, how to capitalize on the sugars that are in the coffee and turn them, or the carbohydrate to turn them into sugar, which you can bring out some nice sweetness in the final cup. And we have a sample roaster, so we can roast very small amounts of things. Most roasters have a sample roaster.
So it's almost like a wine then, when you're trying to roast it in a way that accentuates that particular terroir.
Yeah, I think a good coffee roaster, yes. And like I said, there's a lot of different ways to do it. I mean, some people will want to take their coffee really dark and have it have it taste more roasty or more Italian or whatever verbiage you want to use for that. And most of, I think, specialty coffee is looking to highlight, like you're saying, the what's special about that particular bean.
And I thought of something when we were talking before the show started. Jeff asked me, what do people try to express when they roast? Is that maybe the way you said it? Which I thought was interesting because that question kind of showcases the difference between brewers and roasters, in that where as a brewer, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you start with an idea of what you want the beer to be, and you add these adjuncts or pick the malts that you like or the brewing process or the hops that you want to express that. Whereas with coffee, it's more of a discovery of what's available. Right? A good coffee roaster, and you're right, like a good coffee, or some coffee roasters, might start out with, this is what I want this coffee to be. But really good coffee roasters are going to say, what's here, and how do I guide it to be its best self, not what do I want this to be, Because the coffee, it's just, you don't have ingredients, you don't have things to tweak, like you roast it or you don't. And so it's how do you roast it the best is really like how do you roast what's available to you.
Roasters they'll assess the green coffee and look at the quality of it, take a density reading. There's some factors like that can help determine where to start. And we often start with just like a blanket template roast on the sample roaster and there's some sweetness here, but let's bring out more. Or, like you were saying, let's kind of delve in to see what's in this, what potential this coffee has, and try to highlight the best parts of it.
So if you get a new coffee from a different region, you run it through some sample profile in your test roaster, and you say, it needs a little bit more of this. You tweak it, roast it again until you're sort of happy with the final product.
Yeah. So like in the sample roaster, like we have what we call a profile roaster, similar like a pilot system, like a small roaster, and we'll do a couple batches and we'll taste them, and generally start with like a baseline roast curve that we want to use. And we'll taste them, and then we can pick up different aspects of the roast profile that we either want to change or modify, or like, this coffee has a lot of pyrazines presenting itself, kind of creating a green pepper vegetalness to it. We want to extend this portion of the roast profile because of that to try and sort of develop some of those into sugars, or we feel like this coffee doesn't have enough body, so if we tweak this portion of the roast profile, we think the body will balance out some of these acid structures that are coming forward. So it's... and then sometimes you say, I want more body in this coffee, and then you roast it in that way, and there's just nothing more for it to give. And so, like, you got to kind of retweak and back off, but you kind of can assume different things about the coffee based on the flavor profile and make tweaks to the roast based on that. And then once you get it set, that's what you do.
You mentioned something which I've talked to many brewers about. Pyrazine, is that what the chemical compound is called? Green pepper. Yeah. I notice this all the time when I smell a beer that has had coffee infused in it. Andrew and I literally talked about it last week. And we need to know why it's happening, and if it's a function of the roast that you're getting, if it has higher levels, or if there's something going on with the interaction of alcohol that's making that more apparent.
There's a couple of things. It could be because the coffee's too lightly roasted, depending on that's subjective, but in my opinion, if it's too lightly roasted, you'll get more pyrazine content. It could be the origin of the coffee. Some coffees are just present with a lot more pyrazine than others, but it could also be that the coffee is old.
Okay.
Not the beans. I mean, like the brewed coffee.
But it was roasted and then it's just been sitting too long.
Well, it's old in relation to when it was brewed, right? Which
okay,
is just coffee and beer.
Right,
Sure.
Because
Okay.
Unless you drink
unless-
the whole batch the day, a couple minutes after you make it.
Yeah.
we can
This
talk
is the
about
problem.
that.
You
later.
awake
There
for
are
like 3 days.
Yeah, and drunk for 3 days.
Yeah.
we can talk about this later because there
Only-
are some things you can do to mitigate that in how you brew the coffee. But a lot of it is the coffee was brewed like a month or two ago, so
Right.
it's really old coffee.
Okay.
Well, let's maybe talk about
Okay.
that more
Yeah.
in the beer and coffee section.
Yeah, I want to come back to that because with the Turkish coffee,
Yeah.
and tasting that. Again, we were talking about this last week.
Yeah.
But I want to make sure that we give ample time to our other adjuncts.
Yeah.
And to the spices. So once again, you're watching or maybe listening to BeerCraft, Colorado's craft beer show. I'm Andrew Moore from Intrepid Sojourner Beer Project. Here with Jeff Tyler from Spice Trade Brewing. Joining us this week is Josh Taves from Novo Coffee, Penny Garrett from Copper Door Coffee Roasters, and also Dan Hayward, Spicy Dan
Hi,
from
guys.
Savory Spice Shop. So we're excited to have you on the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
And,
Amazing.
Maybe tell us a little bit about Savory Spice and
Sure.
what's going on with you guys.
Well, Savory Spice, we've been around for almost 15 years. Original store down on Platt Street in downtown Denver. I'm the owner and managing partner of the Boulder location. I've been up there for over 10 years and have been with Savory for nearly 14. And I grew up cooking as a kid, so that's where my passion lay. I worked in the hospitality industry, restaurant industry for about 15 years and nearly 15 in the spice industry, but I've loved cooking and flavor my whole life. And this kind of spoke to both of them, to be not quite in the restaurant business, but to be working with restaurateurs and brewers and distillers and kind of the whole gamut of wherever flavor is needed and interesting combinations of nuances of spices. That's what we do.
That was like the superhero explanation. Wherever flavor is needed.
That's where
Yeah.
we go.
That's where you find spicy Dan.
Exactly. That's
Well, I
right.
have to say though, like that's one of my
Yeah.
like favorite things to do as a brewer, like in working on recipe development as well. Just go down to the Platt Street store and
Yeah.
just smell things until I can't smell anything
Yeah.
anymore. It all just sort of blends together.
No, I remember meeting you down there that
Yeah.
first time, and
And
I love doing that, and
it's
just
a ton
walking
of fun.
around and
Yeah.
smelling everything, tasting things, and
Yeah, I always learn a lot about there's so many spices,
Yeah.
right? Every time I go down there, it's like, well, here's 2 or 3 spices I'd never heard of before.
yeah.
My reaction is like, well, let's put them in beer right away.
The people need to know about these spices. The
People
only
need to
way
We
drink
encourage
them.
that. We encourage that.
People need to
Beer.
drink this soon.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But yeah, so again, so thinking about stouts this month, we wanted to kind of focus on a few of the spices that go in stout. But maybe first, it's good to kind of take a kind of a step back and be like, what is a spice, right?
Sure.
Like how do we define what a spice is?
Well, we differentiate, between spices and herbs, for instance, right? Sure. Is an herb is a spice, and a spice is an herb. So anything that's going to use to flavor food, and in this case, flavor beer, even with coffees and then some other things like that, where you're going to bring in some interesting flavor elements. So that's it. I mean, typically spices would be thought of some woody pieces of plants, nuts, berries, that kind of thing. So, the herbs being more leafy green and more perishable, where spices typically have a longer shelf life, especially in their whole form.
Sure.
Yeah. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense.
Because the spice world is vast.
It is.
It really is.
We could spend a week straight probably talking about different spices.
Sure.
And I'd love to do that
Me too.
sometime.
Yeah.
We can
That's
focus
the
on it. We can
spice
focus on a few.
trade.
Yeah.
See?
Portion of the
as
program
the
here.
spice
Exactly.
trade guy, I would love to
Exactly.
learn more about spices.
Sure.
Um,
Well, there's a long history with spices. Obviously, it never lost on me that I'm in a very old trade. Thousands of years of people have gone before me, and thankfully now we don't have to fight over them
Yeah.
anymore.
Well, yeah, and Jeff, you guys were sort of Spice Trade Brewing sort of came out of that region where a lot of that spice trade, Silk Road,
Yep.
right.
history comes from.
Yeah,
right?
so the spice trade, and I'm not a historian by any means, but the spice trade kind of started around the southern tip of India and Sri Lanka. And it was really the trade epicenter of these really exotic ingredients that were only available in certain parts of the world. They were so exotic and so sought after that literally trade routes were set up throughout Egypt and Europe and China and Indonesia just to get these ingredients to the rest of the world because they were so valuable.
It's fascinating.
Yeah, it's a really interesting history. And now we live in a beautiful, beautiful time that we should all appreciate and be grateful for.
Indeed.
That we can go to a shop like Savory Spice Shop.
It's all under one roof.
It's in one roof.
Yep.
Yeah.
It really is amazing. The accessibility that we have in modern days to get access to these exotic ingredients. And I think, I always learn something when I go into the spice shop. I'd love to chat about cinnamon because cinnamon is one of those ingredients. Where does cinnamon come from? What is cinnamon?
Cinnamon is the bark from a tree in the laurel family. There's two different types of trees. There's Cinnamonum casseum. Cassia is what we know is the cinnamon that we typically all grew up on. And Cinnamonum zeylanicum is more of the true cinnamon. So the origin of cinnamon is, or the cassia is from China, and the true cinnamon is from Sri Lanka. And then they moved around the world. I mean, cinnamon was kept a secret for a long time about where it came from, and then the Europeans started to get their hands on it, and that's what they thought and sought after. And often it was used. It was tributes to kings, or if you could have a big pile of cinnamon on your dinner table or something, it was a show of your wealth and what have you. Kind of like peppercorns as well.
Like peppercorns, or even in Mesoamerica, they had cacao nibs were a form of currency, but also a way to make drinking chocolate. And so there was a high level of wealth and associated with those items because you could. It's like being able to drink $20 bills. If you could drink $20 bills, you're well off.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, we have sources like dating all the way back to the Roman Empire telling us that cinnamon is X times more valuable, 10 times, 20 times more valuable than silver. Like it was almost tracked, like the stock market or something. How valuable is cinnamon today?
And they're
by
not all
futures in the Roman.
Well, that would be great. I mean, it's still lightly traded in some markets here and there, but they're not all created equal. And cinnamon has a lot to do with its oil content. We kind of covered a lot of things. There's a lot of things when we talked about coffee and beans and things like that. There's a lot of crossover and flavor profiles and oil contents and things like that. The standard middle of the road is the Indonesian cassia. It has about a 3 or 4% oil content, which doesn't sound like a lot. Then you get all the way up to the Saigon cinnamon chips that are there, or Vietnamese cinnamon, which has a higher oil content, more like 6 to 8%. And then the true cinnamon from Sri Lanka is about a 1%, and more hints of like citrus and clove. Cassia is a little more spicy and bold.
Right.
And again, more of the flavor that we're typically used to.
Yeah, it's kind of like I always try to explain it to people because in our King Montezuma, which is a Mayan chocolate stout, which we're going to drink in a little bit, we use the Ceylon cinnamon. And it's a much more nuanced, citrusy flavor. And I always tell people what they're used to is kind of that big red gum level of cinnamon, where it's super intense, super over the top, but is not the original cinnamon in the world of cinnamon spices. And there's some differences, too. If you're the discerning spice savant, you can kind of tell the difference. I don't know if we can grab some of these sticks out of the pack here.
Absolutely.
So is the true cinnamon, it's considered the original?
Well, they're just two different trees, and their origins different
it's
as well.
more expensive, though,
It is, because it's not as common. And if you ever have traveled to Mexico and eaten like Mexican sweets or a really good mole, this is the stuff that you see in the market. Rarely would you see the cassia sticks. This is typically what you'd find. But the flavor is just remarkable. And of course, remember, like all the spices, all the oils are all held up inside until you can crack them or roast them or things like that. You guys should smell that. And you can even chew on it a little bit. It's just beautiful.
Is the oil a function of sort of the genetics of the tree, or is it a result of the drying process?
However long they let the tree mature. So, for instance, we do carry organically sourced true cinnamon, Ceylon cinnamon. But the bark is more mature, so it's got a little more spice to it, a little more flavor profile, a little more depth.
And this is a lot looser packed too. If you were to look at these
two,
very
thin pieces of bark. That's
really thin. It's very delicate. It's very loosely packed. And if you grab the other cinnamon, it's very tight. It's very brittle, very hard.
Yeah, it's a thicker piece of bark. That's right. And then they harvest it from the tree and sun dry them, and it kind of naturally curls up on its own. And they kind of cut it into segments of pieces, like cinnamon sticks, like that. Same with the stuff.
How many times can you harvest from the same?
It's years and years. Yeah. So when they plant the tree, a cinnamon tree will, if you let it grow to its own device, it will grow about 80 feet tall. But you can't harvest bark from an 80-foot tall tree. Right. You could, but it would take expert climbers. So they have a practice called coppicing, where they actually cut the tree down and let these they call them fairy rings. that grow up around the stump of the tree. So they're much smaller, more pliable. Now they'll continue to get bigger and bigger as they grow through time. And so at some point, it's just not viable to harvest that bark. But most cinnamon plantations, you're going to see much smaller trees, not full-grown ones. I think they let some grow just for probably tourist things, just to see what it looks like.
And this gets called sweet cinnamon sometimes, doesn't it?
I think so, yeah.
It is sweeter. It's
I mean,
like
I
less
see it
spicy,
called
more
Mexican
sweet.
cinnamon. If you ever see something called Mexican cinnamon, then they're looking for true cinnamon as well. But the
It's
flavor
delicious.
Still, it is delicious.
Yeah.
It's so good.
It's really good.
Yeah.
I just want to pause the show 30 seconds while we all smell.
We all
cinnamon.
smell and taste.
Sound clip of everyone smelling really hard, and then we can all slurp from our coffee spoon.
Perfect.
Yeah,
That's the end of the show.
Yeah,
That's
the
it, right.
soundtrack of Adjunct Brewing.
No, but it's used in so many different types of cuisine. When I've been working with brewers over the years of time, and looking to see what their needs are and what kind of flavor they, when I've talked to you and some other folks, you just give an idea, and let's start tasting and let's start smelling, and then see where we can get from there. Because maybe you do want something softer, and that's going to bring out more of that flavor for like that Montezuma beer you're speaking of. That's going to be more of that traditional, or do you want some more spice in there?
Right.
Where are you going to take it?
Yeah, it's great stuff. Let's jump into some more spices. We're running a little bit low on time, but I'd love to chat about our other spices that we have. I think we have some cardamom.
Yep.
Yeah.
That we wanted to chat about, right?
Yeah, and I discovered doing the research, some of the research for the show, that cinnamon and cardamom have an interesting historical connection in that they were both used as part of the embalming process.
Indeed.
For Egyptian mummies.
Yes.
That's why they smell so good.
Well,
why
that
they
was
smell so
exactly.
good.
Well, then that was partly because
Even now,
to show their
4,000
wealth.
years later.
Mummies smell
Yeah.
great.
To show their wealth.
Yeah.
And mummies smell beautiful.
Yeah.
Never been rotting for years,
Yeah.
thousands of years. Cardamom, typically native to India, used in a lot of, you typically think of like chai tea and curry and what have you using cardamom. It's basically, a seed or a pod from a shrub, a low-growing shrub. India was a major supplier for many, many years, and probably about a decade ago, or maybe a little bit longer, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Honduras got on board and started growing the plant because they knew it was a big moneymaker.
When I was in Guatemala, almost every coffee shop, they put some fresh ground cardamom in with the coffee.
Yeah.
And
That
I
makes sense.
was addicted to it after that.
Yeah, I bet.
It's such a lovely
That's something
partnership.
like that Turkish
well,
coffee,
that's
right?
On that note,
Yeah.
we're getting low. We're going to start cracking open the beer
let's-
here.
Okay.
let's do this.
Keep
Let's
talking, but this is a
No,
this-
absolutely.
Since we're talking about
yeah,
cardamom. I mean, that's how I got introduced to cardamom. It was the same way. So,
Yep.
being in the Middle East and Turkey, they boiling the Turkish coffee, but then they throw a couple of green cardamom pods in the chesve, and it suddenly becomes Arabic coffee, and it's got a really nice spice to it.
And lightly, lightly bruising them will give a little more flavor to them as
Right.
well. Bring out that we have just the corticated seeds
Right.
and/or the ground as well. Just a lovely flavor. It's kind of eucalyptus-like. There's really no hard, a little sweet as well. What other spices do we have here that we need to talk about?
Well,
man?
and maybe before we jump to another spice, we just maybe elucidate for everybody.
Yeah.
So there's two kinds of cardamom, right? Or at least two kinds.
Sure.
But green and black are
That's
the two
correct.
that everyone's sort of
Yep.
familiar with.
And you'll see white out there as well, which are
White.
bleached. The green cardamom are the more common. The black are much larger pods and a little more almost smoky and woody, a much more bold cardamom flavor. We use them in some of our Moroccan blends and some of our like a chai blend and things like that. It's a really interesting flavor and a bolder way to kind of bring in that cardamom flavor. Sometimes you can use less. Of course, I have some bitters makers that use black cardamom. A little more rare and harder to find. I think we sell it on our website now. We don't sell it in our shops anymore, but we still have it and still have access to it. But it's a whole different nuance. I wish I had brought some because they're really pretty.
Are they different species or?
They're like cousins to each other.
Okay.
Yeah, kind of like the cinnamons. They're cousins, about the same. But yeah.
Yeah, and that's just, you've got Turkish coffee stout in front of you from Intrepid Sojourner. And so it's those kind of Robusta coffees. I've learned today that I've been saying it wrong for years now. Robusta coffees.
Robusta.
It's a long U. I'm going to have to draw the bar over the U, but and then it's I think a sort of a blend of Robusta coffees with that green cardamom in there. And then because Turkish coffee is usually boiled with sugar to kind of tame it, especially for tourists, we added sweet orange peel. So you don't get orange, I think, so much as it just kind of softens the palate and keeps some of the stout malts from being too astringent and the coffee from being a little too tannic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a nice balance. I really like the use of cardamom. We use it in our chai milk stout, and I think cardamom adds a really nice kind of cooling menthol-like balance to maybe a more full-bodied or more acidic, darker roasted beer. So I totally see why people have historically used it in coffee and why it's also a great spice to use in beer.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and this is maybe a good time to just talk a little bit more about that green pepper flavor that we were talking about a little bit more, because the Turkish coffee stout is one where like occasionally you'll get a whiff of green pepper, like because so the way we put the coffee in the beer is we just dump the Turkish coffee straight into the fermenter.
At what stage?
So it's basically in secondary fermentation, right? So we'll let the coffee be in the beer for a couple days, then we'll cold crash the fermenter down to 38 degrees, and we'll transfer it off of the yeast and coffee and then find it in the bright tank. So I find that like that green pepper flavor often comes out when you're getting maybe to the bottom of the keg or you're...
And when you say you add the Turkish coffee, you mean it's brewed in a Turkish method, or it's just ground?
No, it's just ground. It's just a
You're buying it from a Turkish coffee
provider, yes.
Got it. Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean that's a little different. Typically, you'll find it more like if it's brewed hot.
Sure.
I don't, Jeff. We've never really talked about this, but I don't know how you're incorporating the coffee into your beers all the time. But
We do a lot of different methods.
Yeah.
We do hot. We've tried hot infusions. We typically do cold side after fermentation infusions in a couple different ways.
Yeah.
After we met last time and talked about kind of that slipstream hot infusion method,
Like in a Randall? Or?
sort of in a Randall or in like a yeast brink style keg, where as you're on your way to your knockout before you get to your heat exchanger, you're cycling through the grounds at a specific hot temperature for a specific amount of time that matches up with the recommended hot brewing time and temperature. And then once that time and temperature is done, you cut off that part of the flow loop and then continue your chilling process. We've tried that with amazing results in the first day, and then by the time you get to the point where the beer is ready to consume, it's just that flavor degrades so much by then. It's
You're capturing a lot of the volatiles, like a lot of the volatile aromatics from the coffee, but they're not going to last.
They're not going to, okay.
And that's when that's when I've found, at least, that they tend to develop into those pyrazine green pepper type flavors.
when it's added on the hot side more than cold side. Okay.
Yeah, so I don't really know what to say about the way you're doing it, because I would probably attest to the type of coffee you're using at that point, because you're basically just cold brewing it, and that'll extend the shelf life of the coffee, of the brewed coffee for sure. It's really hard to work in an industry where we buy coffee and then we roast it and it's called coffee, and then we brew it and it's called coffee. They say like coffee, and like, well, are you talking about green coffee or coffee growing or coffee roasting or coffee buying or coffee?
Yeah.
Anyways, the brewed coffee you're using is we need some more words. It's essentially it's just cold brew, right? And that has a much longer shelf life as long as it's kept refrigerated. And so I would probably just attest whatever flavors you're getting out to the coffee you're using itself. And you can definitely taste the Robusta in here. Like, there's a little bit of like iodine, like rubber flavor to it that's going to come from that coffee in particular. But,
Nice.
But it adds like a really cool, complex depth to the beer.
Yep. And the cardamom and the orange are just perfectly subtle. That's what I've usually found with most brewers when I've talked to them. Like, the spices are important, but they want them to kind of be almost like, you want to kind of guess and like get people to kind of like, wow, what is that flavor? What am I getting here? It's really interesting.
I think something we both attest to is that sort of less is more philosophy.
Yep.
Like,
more is too much usually.
More is usually too much.
I've found, I've done a little bit of just kind of amateur home brewing at home. At home, you homebrew at home. It's a general
Homebrew,
rule.
you can brew other places.
Making herbal beers and wines and meads and concoctions grain-free, just because it's simple. I just ferment things and see what happens.
Sure.
And, and the interesting thing about herbs and spices is when you ferment them, sometimes you don't know what's going to happen.
Yep.
I remember the first time I made an orange clove thing, the oranges disappeared, right?
Yeah.
Just like you were saying, they just became sugar for the yeast, I guess. And I put in 5 gallons, I think 2 tablespoons of cloves. Didn't seem like hardly anything.
And it was way too
it would
much.
numb your mouth.
It was too much.
zingy, and it was
Yeah.
like you were at the
Yeah.
dentist and your mouth was numb.
Yeah.
And as it aged, it mellowed out into something I thought was nice, but would
Okay.
be way too much for like a
Yeah.
commercial setting.
Sure. Yep.
But
Right.
it's super interesting what happens with
Yeah,
fermentation.
the recommendation
Yeah.
I've heard, and I don't know where I heard this from, but it's find a recipe you like and scale the spice dosing for serving of 4 to 6 people. And that's how much spice you would put in a 5-gallon batch of homebrew beer.
Oh,
Okay.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes
yeah, and
sense.
2 tablespoons of cloves is more than you need.
way
for
too much.
2
Yeah.
tablespoons is a lot. When you said that, I was like, what? I was like, I probably put, we put like.
I had no idea.
It might have been a
in
quarter teaspoon.
Yeah, in a 250-gallon batch of our chai milk stout, we probably put, if you were to fill this glass up with the chai spices,
We'll
like
say that's
this
maybe 2
much.
ounces maximum.
Yeah, very
For
small
250
amounts.
gallons.
And it depends on the spice. Most of it's cardamom,
Sure.
and that's what goes a long way.
Yeah.
Star anise goes a really
Yeah, I almost brought that
long
one as
way.
well, and I've done that before and
Yeah.
overdone something with star anise like really
Yeah.
quick.
Yeah.
Becomes
That's
a
how you
li-
learn.
A licorice
yeah.
bomb pretty
Yep.
quickly.
What else do we
Okay.
have?
So we have one more. We brought our King Montezuma, which
Okay.
is our Mayan chocolate imperial stout. This is a cool beer. It's mimicked after kind of the base recipe for
Oh, thanks.
ancient Mayan drinking chocolate. So ancient Mesoamerica, originally the Olmecs went to the Aztecs, went to the Maya, but this history of making chocolate in drinking format is prevalent throughout that time. And again,
Sure.
the cacao nibs were seen as currency, so only the wealthy would drink it. The ancient King Montezuma was rumored to have drank like 50 cups of this a day for its aphrodisiac
Sure.
properties, and so he was kind of the high end of people consuming drinking chocolate. But Mayan drinking chocolate was made by essentially crushing cacao nibs, which are the raw ingredient used to make chocolate, mixing that sometimes with honey as a little bit of a sweetener, but mostly with water and vanilla and cinnamon, and a blend of roasted chili peppers. So it actually does have some spice and some heat to it. And so that was the genesis of this beer, was to try to mimic that flavor profile.
Okay.
So the base beer here is going to be a very rich, full-bodied imperial stout. So this one I think is about 10. I'll pour little bits here.
Thank you.
This one is about I think 10+% alcohol. It's got a nice rich chocolatey base profile, not from actual chocolate, just from the malts that
Malts.
we use.
Okay.
And then the vanilla is added in secondary, and the roasted chilies are added in secondary also.
Vanilla is another spice that I love to see in stouts, but it originated in the same region as
That's
this
right.
Mexican drinking chocolate that you were.
We have to,
talking
yeah,
about.
we have Cortez, the discoverer, to thank for that. When he met Montezuma and found vanilla, that is all its origins, all from Mexico, and
Yeah.
then they brought it back to Europe, and it took about till the 16th century for them to figure out how to propagate the plant.
Yeah, because what I understand is that for a long time it was like an exotic perfume in
Sure.
Western Europe. You would rub it on your body as opposed to ingesting it in a beverage.
Yeah.
And it took a long time to like make that transition. And now,
Yeah,
of
once they
course-
figured out that the plant needed to be hand pollinated, because they took it out of its natural environment,
Right.
then they started to get the actual viable product. And this beautiful, this bean which takes, 6 months or more or 9 months to get down to this.
Yeah.
There's a big vanilla shortage in the world right now, as you guys know as brewers, and you're buying vanilla. It's
Yeah.
incredibly expensive. We hope that more and more will come on the market, but it takes a long time to get there.
Yeah.
And so we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, I think coffee's a little bit this way, but like olives are
Yep.
this way, and
Yeah.
hops are this way. Like it takes
Sure.
2 or 3 years for
Yep.
that plant to mature and
That's
start
right.
producing a usable bean.
Yeah. Yeah, the only fruit-producing orchid in the world out of about 30,000 varieties. There's only one that makes these.
Wow.
Unbelievable. Mother Nature at its finest.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, and it's such a great ingredient too to use in beers. You can use it very subtly in beers, just to kind of as like a accentuation kind of ingredient, like adding some salt to something to make stuff pop. You can kind of add some vanilla to make something kind of subtly sweet and round out some flavors. So this beer has Mexican vanilla
Great.
in it. And I just took a sip of it, and you can, after smelling the Ceylon cinnamon, you can really taste it in the beer specifically versus kind of that more big red cinnamon flavor that people are used to
Yeah.
with cinnamon.
This is really
I totally catch
interesting.
it. It's perfect.
There's like some bright acidity there that I wasn't expecting from such a dark beer.
Yeah.
It's like
Those chilies are nice in there too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can definitely, it hits on the backside.
Yeah,
It's
the
perfect.
chilies kind of hit on the backside. I think it does get a little bit of not all those chilies are spicy.
Sure.
There's Pasilla Negra and
Yep.
ancho chilies, and those aren't spicy at all. It tastes like raisins almost.
Yeah, sure. Those are on a 10 scale. Those are, like 1s or 2s. If you use just a very simple 10 scale for heat.
Right.
And then, then I think you brought Urfa chili
Urfa chili,
and Aleppo.
Aleppo.
And those are more like 3s and 4s.
Yeah, and the
on the 10
Urfa
scale.
has some salinity to it too. It's a little bit salty almost.
They put
Urfa
salt in
chilies.
there. Yeah, they mix salt in.
There you go. So I think that
Yep.
that saltiness combined with some of the acidity from the darker roast is what makes that kind of acidity pop when you first drink it, because it does have that kind of acidic component to it. But it's just
Very nice.
It's a good sipping beer.
Yeah. Thanks for pouring us just a little.
Yeah,
since we're day
so we
drinking
made this
and
mistake
all.
last week. We had Cerebral on, and we had Westbound and Down on. And everyone brought like 10 to 17% imperial stouts, and they were
Oh my.
delicious,
Yeah.
really good beers. But it was
Yeah, by the end of 2 hours, it was kind of hard to think about anything else.
yeah.
Have you guys ever? I know Jeff, have you ever been to Big Beers, Barley Wines, and
Yeah,
Yeah.
Big beers, Belgians, and
that,
barley
Yep.
wines.
that
Yeah.
tasting event afterwards is rough.
it is. Yeah,
It
Yeah.
is.
You better hope you're staying up there for
Yeah.
that one. Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
gotta
that's-
just start doing it at night and set up cots and sleeping bags.
That's a good idea.
Campgrounds.
That's an absolutely good idea.
Just sleepover podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe next year we'll do a live stream from Big Beers, Belgians, and barley wines.
That'd be awesome.
There you go.
We'll have to do it early
Great.
in the tasting.
Yeah.
I would start, start early. Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure. Awesome. Well, do we have any other beers to taste through?
Yeah, I think Dan brought some beer for us. We
Nice.
should taste through. Speaking of
Oh,
Mexican
nice,
chocolate.
nice. This is Copper Kettle Brewing Company's Mexican Chocolate Stout.
Yep.
Really, really cool beer. And I'm actually excited to taste it side by side King Montezuma because it has a very similar flavor profile, very similar design intent with the beer.
It's kind of what I thought. Yeah, I like where they're going with the spice, and I've had a couple of them. They're fantastic. Not sure the ABV on that one.
7, I believe.
Oh, a little,
7.
7%.
okay.
Yep.
So a little bit lower. But I'm interested to see, we do,
Hey, all right.
yeah, nice. We,
Active.
yeah. We work pretty closely with those guys over at Copper Kettle, and they make awesome beer.
Yeah.
And I'm interested just to kind of do the side by side because I have not done a side by side with their version of it. And so, I mean, you can essentially you're trying to make the same style beer, a Mayan or Mexican inspired
Sure.
chocolate stout,
Yep.
and I guarantee you it's going to taste very different based on what blend of chili peppers they use and what their malt profile is like, and
Yep.
what kind of vanilla they use, and
Yep.
their ABV is a lot different, so the viscosity is going to be a lot less in this beer. So it'll be cool to taste the two
Thanks, Jay.
side by side here.
Tried to leave
Very
you
nice
some.
one.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
That was kind of you.
We did.
Is that for you too?
Yeah, your portion fell out of
Was
the
it?
can.
We did
You shake
couple
this
of-
up
Is that
on the
right?
way in?
Yeah, sorry. It was a little bumpy on the way in.
We did a couple of one-off kegs with Copper Kettle last January where they put coffee. We used a very earthy, full-bodied Indonesian coffee in this beer. That turned out pretty cool.
A little sweeter. Chili's hit a little differently.
Yeah.
That's kind of an interesting parallel to acidity in coffee. Is a lot of times you identify the acidity in the coffee by where it hits in your mouth and what the sensation is. And chilies kind of are like that in
Oh,
a
yeah.
different way, like
Yep.
where they hit your mouth and when, right?
Yeah, spicy's towards the back, typically, so that's where you catch it on the back end. More
Yeah.
often than not, sweets
And
in
some
the,
of them
sweets
are
in the
like,
front.
are like immediate, and other
Yeah.
ones are.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm
Totally.
always curious about the win. Like, what is it about a chili that you're like, oh, it's a slow creeper, or it's like
Yeah.
immediately like pouring water over your face? Like, what is this?
Well, it has a lot to do with its capsaicin level, you know,
Sure.
and how spicy it becomes. But your receptors in the brain tell you that it's spicy. It's more, your taste buds will catch it, obviously, but it's more about how it lights up your brain, and how much dopamine is being released from the chilies. Now, if you grow up eating really spicy chilies, then obviously you see
higher tolerance for
you have
it.
much higher tolerance.
Yeah.
Where if we were to all chomp into a ghost chili right now, it'd probably be great for Facebook, of course.
Yeah. A lot of views that would
And we would
Yeah.
all see what happened. Everyone would have a different reaction, pretty much. Probably most of us would just be crying and on the floor.
Yeah,
and the
I
show
think
would
it's
be over.
interesting because you have your sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami
Yep.
sensors in your tongue, but Capsaicin is the one where it's a physical inflammation of your mouth, right? Of the
Right,
mucous
yeah.
membrane in your mouth, and it's not something that
not
can
a
just go
flavor,
away. It's not
yeah.
a flavor. Like you can do things to make it feel a little bit better, like. But it's got your taste buds are still inflamed. It's not going to just go away. I've actually heard an interesting anecdote that a lot of people say milk works, although that's kind of debunked. But tequila shots or any high-proof spirits will
yes.
help dissolve the capsaicin that's left over in your tongue into
Good to
solution
know.
and alcohol.
Yeah.
And then you swallow it. Whatever's there is still, the inflammation's
Well, that
still
makes
there, but
perfect
the
sense.
capsaicin's gone.
Because in Mexico there's a lot of spicy food in Mexico, and
drink
there's
a lot of
always
tequila.
And they drink a lot,
tequila.
yeah.
So
I like it when the
They're
answer
onto
is
something.
drink alcohol.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm okay with that.
Yeah. And this does both. So it's like a yin and yang. It hurts you and then it helps you.
Yeah. Do you know? Are we the only mammals that eat hot chilies?
Well, mammals have the only receptors, so birds do not.
Okay.
So birds love chilies. So there's some chilies in the world they call them bird chilies because they love to eat them, but they don't have the same
Like the
receptors.
Thai bird chilies.
Yeah,
Is that one?
they're
Yeah.
Thai. Yeah, there's
Red chilies.
like chili paquin. Sometimes they call them bird chilies. There's some African chilies that are called bird chilies.
Okay.
People come in the shop. Sometimes they have problems with mammals in their garden and things like that. I'm like, just sprinkle ghost chili everywhere. They'll stop,
Yeah.
and they do.
Yeah. That's what you used to do with family that raised horses, and they would suck on the wood of the stalls.
Yeah,
I
you
guess
just
they
put
would get
some-
a high off of the glue in the wood.
Yeah.
And you just go out and put Tabasco sauce on the wood, and they would
Yeah.
immediately.
Yeah, it's interesting.
But it feels like we do it
Poor horses.
humans do it for pleasure.
Well, yeah.
There's people eat spicy things
Yes.
because they like it.
Well, your brain forgets the pain but remembers the pleasure.
Yeah.
And that's why you like when you're eating a spicy salsa, and you're kind of like, God, it's so hot.
You got to keep eating it.
But
though.
you're
You
like,
can't
I just
stop
want
eating it.
more.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Kind of like your beer and this beer. It's kind of like that. Like I really want more of that because
Yeah.
the heat in there is just right. I mean,
Yeah.
when you get beyond a certain point, then
Yeah.
it's just not pleasurable
Yeah,
anymore.
I think that's important in dishes, also in beer, right? Is to have that kind of balance. I think
Right.
both of
Yeah.
these get at that really nicely, where it's not just like a capsaicin hit in the face.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it goes really nicely with the chocolate
Mm-hmm.
and the vanilla and the other flavors that are coming through the beer.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, absolutely. I think spice when used in right moderation in cooking and in brewing is great. I think salt use is an underused. I mean, it's very popular in gozas as a very important ingredient, and there are salts in, water chemistry modifications. But I think using salt as an accent, kind of like you can use vanilla as an accent in brewing, is something that can really kind of elevate those flavors, depending on what your flavors are, to the next level.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, we're coming to the end of the hour, so
I feel like we just scratched.
We just scratched
I think we just barely
the
touched
surface.
it.
We could do
Yeah.
a couple more episodes. We could do a
all
whole
three
month
of you
on
will
spice
be
and
invited
coffee.
back in the future. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
We could talk about
Thank
this all
you.
day.
So we're going to continue to drink beer, I think, but off of
Yes.
Facebook.
Let's do that.
Okay.
We
Let's
encourage you, if you're watching this on Facebook, to crack open your favorite stout.
Even if you're in the office.
Even if you are in the office, especially if you're in the office.
We won't tell your boss. We promise.
Exactly.
I think if you're in an office you can't drink beer in, you're probably in the wrong office.
Yeah. See.
You're at least
Exactly.
not in a Colorado
Find a new
office.
office.
Yeah.
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 Find a new office. Advice from Beercraft.
Quit your job.
Yeah.
Wow.
So next week we'll be back
We're
here,
all in
same
trouble.
time here in the Studio Kitchen, Colorado, 2:30 on Wednesday the 27th.
Yeah.
It'll be our last episode about stout.
Yeah, and it's going to be a cool episode. We're going to be bringing food into the spectrum with some live cooking, some recipes you can make at home, and some really talented chefs from right here in Colorado. They're going to be talking about some pretty cool recipes and how those can be paired with beer, and specifically how they can be paired with stouts.
Yeah, absolutely. So definitely join in, again, 2:30 Wednesday,
yeah.
February 27th. And this has been Beercraft, live from Studio Kitchen, Colorado on the Modern Eater Network. Thanks for joining us.